Hey friends, welcome back to Sound Living with Madi. Today I am joined by Jessica Dixon-Neal. She is one of our licensed therapists at Soaak clinics. Today we're talking about trauma and how to identify it in your life, how to process it in a healthy way that helps you realign with your core values. So let's get into it.
This is a Soaak podcast.
Hey, I'm Madi, and this is Sound Living, a space for real conversations about intentional living, wellness, and personal growth. Here, we dive into practical tools, mindset shifts, and the little changes that make a big impact. Whether you're looking to create balance, build better habits, or just feel more in tune with yourself, you're in the right place. Let's get into it.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Madi.
Thank you so much for joining today. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thanks for the invite.
Yeah, of course. So I just kind of want to get started. Our guests probably don't know this, but Jessica is one of our therapists at Soaak Clinics. She is phenomenal, has a wonderful background in trauma therapy. And so she is joining us today to dive in and answer questions. So Jessica, let's start with your story. What got you into this line of work?
Gosh, it's sort of a twisty, turny story. But I think that looking back, this was something that was always on my radar, even when I, first went to undergrad. And like most, 20-somethings, I didn't really have it all together. Not that I do today, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I think I probably picked like 6 or 7 different majors by the time that I graduated. Ended up graduating with an art education degree. And I taught for 9 years and then decided to have a family, and that took on a life of its own, as it always does. Took a couple of different career paths. And I think that, through a couple of different life events and just really settling into what I feel like was just self-awareness and knowing more about myself, it sort of came back into my heart, I would say probably about my mid to late 30s. My kids were, getting a little bit older, but they weren't quite old enough yet then for me to go where I would feel good about going back and doing school. So sometime in my 40s, the Lord really just put it on my heart, and it was like the time is now.
Yeah.
And so I did. I just decided to jump in, and at that point, my kids were old enough to not need me around all the time. And I still had enough energy at that point to stay up till 1 or 2 in the morning,
Study.
Yes. But that's kind of where it went. And so I was working full time, being a mom and a wife, and then doing grad school. And I just feel like it was, yeah. But I loved it.
Yeah.
It was just such a sweet time. I feel like that it was just a time that I look back and I'm like, how did I do that?
Yeah.
But I just know that it was something that when the Lord says this is time,
Yes.
he sustains you through things that you look back and go like, how did I even do that? I don't know.
I have seen that in my own life as well, and that's something that I really resonate with. So did you always know that you would have kind of a special space for trauma in your practice?
That's a great question. I think my initial response to that is no. In my mind, I had this whole like grand picture of what things were going to look like. And, typical of at least the way that my life works, I have all these plans, and then the Lord is like, nope, we're over here now, know? And so, my very first job offer after I graduated was at a community mental health clinic. And anytime that you are working in community mental health, you tend to see just such a higher level of trauma. And I think most of that is just, it has a lot to do with the location. And in Oklahoma, we have a lot of rural area. And so access to mental health in rural areas is really limited, but it's so needed. And so it was sort of my exposure there that as I started, I think it was just such an eye-opener. And again, that back to that sustaining piece, it really, I feel like that through some of my own story, and then some events that, I've had as an adult with other family members, I thought, oh, the Lord was preparing me for this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what about your background in, did you say it was art education?
It was. Mm-hmm.
So a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed someone who, she's a former nurse, and now she does types of art therapy where she makes different pieces that, you know, are made intentionally to impact your brain state, and neuroaesthetics is what she calls
cool.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about the connection between art and art therapy and how that impacts like your mental state.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you kind of drew from some of that history in your kind of therapist journey?
I do. You know, in my much younger, in my 20s, when I thought, oh, I think I want to do therapy, it was art therapy. I mean, that was always sort of my goal. But I grew up in New Mexico, which is a super artsy place.
Yeah,
and
totally.
so, you know, so I kind of feel like that had just a huge impact on my desire to do art therapy. But now that I'm doing, you know, I have an art background and now I'm doing therapy, I definitely pull as many expressive forms into therapy as I can. And so, yeah, that has definitely helped.
What are some of your favorite things that you pull in?
I love helping people redefine their own concept of self.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. But usually, I mean, some of my favorite paintings are just self-portraits, but in a way that depicts them as somebody that they see themselves as versus like how they think the world sees them.
Yeah. So do you ask them to do like two different images? One where it's like, how do you see yourself? And then how do you think that other people see you?
Yes. Yeah. And sometimes we'll do like a split image where like it on
half
the
face.
half. Yeah.
And what usually comes of that?
Oh man, that's a great question. It's really interesting because almost never do the halves align. You know, the way that people think that the world sees them versus how they see themselves.
Yeah.
It's really like dichotomous is like the only word that I can think of.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times it's like, oh, the world sees me as this terrible person, or the world sees me as this like perfect person that is not perfect, but this is it. And so it's really opposite.
Yeah. Do you think the goal is to align those things?
I do. I'm a big supporter of congruence.
Yeah, totally.
But it's like that word sounds like, oh man, that's a big word. But then it's like, oh, that sounds so easy. Like, just be who you are. But I think that it's
if
so
only
difficult.
it was so easy.
Right? It's so difficult. It's so difficult. And there's so much stuff that gets in the way of that.
So if there's someone listening who feels that like duality in their life where they feel like they're not seen as who they truly are, what are some simple things that they can start doing today to kind of bring those two halves or worlds together?
Man, great question. You know, I think that most of the time starting inward is at least where I encourage people, really becoming comfortable with yourself and building your own self-awareness. Because truly what begins to happen is when we begin to rebuild our self-awareness and our concept of self, the way that we think the world sees us changes. When we're more confident and we're more accepting of ourselves, it projects out.
Yeah. Do you think that, so my mind goes kind of one of two places. It's either maybe the person doesn't really know themselves, like they don't do enough self-reflection and they're unsure of who they are, or maybe they know who they are and they're afraid of rejection, or, you know, they want everyone to like them, or, you know, I definitely remember, especially like in my teens, I just could not bear the thought of someone not liking me. Like I would adapt to whatever friend group I was going into because I wanted to fit in, right? Like it's human nature. We all want to fit in.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely feel that. I think, you know, I think of when I'm in therapy with people, I always think the word connection is almost always on my mind, and we're built for it. You know, and so
we have to have it to survive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, when I think of connection, I think of it in two ways, like connection with others, but then also connection to self.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when we're seeking the approval of others because we're so terrified of rejection, what starts to happen is I think that when we're not really internalizing and reflecting inward, we begin to lose that connection with ourselves at the expense of. And so, so that's really what I try to keep in mind. And, since we were kind of talking about trauma, it's interesting because trauma is absolutely one of the things that will disrupt both of those.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people talk about trauma, right? Some people use the term really lightly. It's become kind of a buzzword.
Yeah.
Some people may have experienced it, but don't identify it because maybe they know someone who experienced worse trauma. How do you define trauma?
So, clinically, we always have to look at, okay, what does the DSM say? 'Cause the DSM is like our Bible, right? And the DSM, essentially, it's just exposure to anything that threatens your life or safety. Okay. And this can be either like experienced one-on-one, or you can witness this in someone else, but that is how it defines trauma, which I think is tricky because I truly believe that where we go wrong with trying to define trauma is that we begin defining it by the event.
Yeah.
So, and we think that trauma is something that causes like a defect in us. So, there's two things here. Like we look at the event and then we're like, oh, and then, Susie experienced, fill in the blank, and she was never the same after that. She never recovered.
Yeah.
And the reality is it's not the event. It is our experience of the event. That's the trauma. Trauma's felt.
Yeah.
And so when I'm defining trauma, I always try to help people understand that I know there's this idea of like big trauma, big T, little t. And we create this like hierarchy of tragedy in our mind, right? But our brain doesn't do that. The amygdala, is the actual center of our limbic system, and it is what turns on fight or flight, and it is not sophisticated. Like, it's not a smart part of our brain. It's just very primal. And so, like, when it doesn't know the difference between big T and little t, it just knows that something just violated your core sense of safety, and it turns on.
Yeah. And do you think that can also be experienced through, like, I don't know if this is the clinical term, but what I'm calling like secondhand trauma?
Yeah.
Like something happened to someone that someone that you were close with, or maybe you weren't, you just see them every day and you kind of identify as being, in similar walks of life, and something really horrible happens in their life. Is there a version of like secondhand trauma where that shifts your core beliefs on like what can happen in the world?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and you and I kind of talked about this a little bit, but there are different types of trauma. The types of trauma are different than the hierarchy that we try to create in our mind. But that's a great point. I mean, you can be a witness to someone else's trauma and have your own be affected by that because, trauma's felt. And so if it affects us and it shakes our own sense of safety in some way, then we're going to experience that.
Yeah. So if someone is listening to this and they are resonating with it, obviously there's some form of like self-awareness where they're thinking, hey, like, I don't feel as safe as I used to, or the world feels scarier than it used to, and that can happen too with political shifts and with new environments and, moving, whether that's schools or states or, just something changing in your life. I think change can maybe cause trauma, and and this word, it has become kind of this big scary word, and I think people are afraid to call it what it is. But for someone who's listening and they've kind of identified, okay, something in my life is not making me feel as secure as it once was, what is the first step that they can take to start rectifying that?
Obviously as a therapist, I'm like, my first thing is always like therapy, but the reality is that therapy isn't for everyone. And it's not the only way that people can heal. And so I would just encourage people to really find something that allows them to begin rebuilding their inner sense of safety first. Because if we can feel safe in our own bodies, we can then trust our own instincts. And if we can trust our own instincts, then we can start to feel safer in the world. And safer with others.
Yeah, I love that. I think that for me personally, faith plays a really big role in that like safety and security.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have certain affirmations or mindful intentions that I always go back to and kind of remind myself like everything is happening for me, no matter what it looks like, you know, to the world. I carry this core belief that everything is happening for my good. Like the world is happening for me. Everything's aligning in my favor, no matter what that looks like right now. And I, you know, I've seen in my life like some really silly examples. When I was working as an intern in DC, I got assigned to essentially a closet as like my desk. And I was really bummed, and I was a little mad too. Like there, I got pulled away from all of the people that I had made friends with and that I was talking to, and this is where my desk was. And it's so silly. I was like 20, but I was mad, and I literally pulled myself into the stairwell. And I said, I am not going to let bitterness grow inside me. That was like my big affirmation in the moment. This is working out for me. This is working out in my favor. Good things are coming from this. And sure enough, I ended up meeting one of my best friends who sat right next to me in that closet that I didn't know before. I had the best work schedule. Like being in this one particular area just ended up working out in my favor in so many ways. And it was something that I was so upset about and felt like it was a disadvantage. And then I pulled back those core beliefs, and voila, there we go. It's working out in my favor.
Right.
And I feel like that's something that is really powerful, is like having those things to hold on to that kind of combat that feeling of not feeling safe or settled or like things are going well for you.
Right.
We say a lot of the time mindsets manifest. So.
Yeah, that's interesting, because what you just described, I feel like is exactly what trauma disrupts and makes really difficult for people to hold on to.
Yeah.
And so trying to help people find just a small way that they can have some type of experience like that, where they do have an internal shift that says, oh, I can. You know, whatever it is, I can control whatever's happening in my body. I can control what my thoughts are like, or just that small inner shift is such a great place to start.
So my, desk in the closet example, obviously not trauma.
Well, but just remember, trauma is felt. So, I mean,
Do you have what are some unexpected ways that trauma might show up in someone's day-to-day life? And is it even something that we should be looking for?
Oh, so yes, I do feel like it is something that we should be looking for. I think that the world is more difficult. I do. Yeah. I think there are things happening now, and maybe that's not 100% accurate. Like maybe it's just that we have access all the time now through the media and through social media, and so we're always aware of all the bad, right?
Well, that's what gets eyeballs on the content, right? Yeah, like it's what sells,
right? I say this all the time, that I feel like that the mainstream media is very predatory, right? It preys on people's fears. But with that, I think that yes, we should always be aware that it's possible that what we're seeing in a person might not just be anger, or it might not just be like, oh man, that guy, he's never in a good mood. He's just always such a grouch, or, so-and-so just I feel like I can't even tell them something, but they're just going to totally break down. Right. And I feel like sometimes if we could just slow down a little bit and start really having a little bit more, of course, in therapy, we call this having like a trauma-informed lens, right? But just really being aware that people are struggling, and often it is connected to some type of trauma that they have experienced, and they're just trying to make it through that day. Yeah. Because that truly is a very difficult thing for people who have experienced trauma and have not experienced healing.
Mm-hmm. So if someone has, I'm sure that people listening can immediately think of someone in their life where we all can, right? What's the best way to approach someone like that? While holding your own boundaries too.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think approaching with what I call kind of a kind curiosity is always such a relief to people. You know, you don't have to point out like, hey, John, like you seem like you're always in a bad mood, right? They're going to be like, well, okay, great, thanks. But, you know, if we look at them and we say, wow, it seems like today might be really tough.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's going on that I could help with? And just being kindly curious about what's going on for that person and knowing that you're in their path for a reason.
Yeah.
And trying to be curious about what you can do.
Right.
You know, and then obviously to the boundaries part, if they ask something outrageous, which I find most people don't,
Yeah.
you know, they're actually very surprised when somebody stops for a moment and says like, is there anything I can do for you today?
Yeah. Instead of just kind of ignoring the unpleasantness, just approach it with that kind curiosity. I love that. That's such great advice.
Yeah.
I also love what you said too about us. And I think we talked a little bit off air about this the other day, but you know, we were never meant to carry the burden of the entire world. And now with social media and the news and, you know, everything being right there at our fingertips and the news alerts coming up on your Apple Watch and your phone, we carry this burden of everything that's going wrong in the world. Because it's, you know, they're not sending out news stories about, you know, butterflies and puppy dogs.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that has really impacted the younger generations, because it is something where, you know, that's what they're seeing flash across the screen, and they're spending a lot of time in front of screens too. And you find a lot of people struggling with anxiety, and, you know, they're afraid of leaving their house. They're afraid of social situations. They're afraid of getting sick. I mean, the way that COVID was blasted amongst all of us, I think that traumatized the entire world. It really changed the way that we even operate. I was having a conversation with my husband a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about, you know, how we approach sickness and germs and everything now versus, you know, back when I was in high school. I can remember even if my friend had the flu or something, I would go over to their house and bring them something. I wasn't, you know, having a mask on, standing 6 feet away. You know, maybe I should have. I never got the flu. Right. But, you know, something that happened is we really, obviously we scared everyone. And of course, you know, COVID was a thing and it happened, but I think it probably was sensationalized and in a way that, you know, happened over the course of these past 5 years or so. And there's a group of, you know, adolescents and people that were growing up through that who will never think about, you know, germs and sickness the same way. And I don't think that they would ever be in the position where I was in, where I'm, you know, showing up to my friend's house, even though they have the flu and a, you know, 101 degree fever.
Right. Yeah.
It's just wild how we have so drastically changed as just how we operate, and you know, getting into the implications on, you know, how that affects our microbiome and, you know, our immune system. That's a whole other conversation. Right. But one that I think was led by a lot of fear and just like a global trauma.
For sure. Yeah. You know, right after COVID, I think that the mental health world like was set on fire. You know, and we were just really trying to, I mean, it was like a wildfire that was uncontrolled in a field. I mean, and then someone poured gasoline on it. Yeah. Because we had people that had been in isolation for so long. And you know, when we talk about the tragedy of COVID, I think the tragedy of COVID was the extreme isolation. Yes. And that's really where people were and felt the most traumatized, was not being able to be with their loved ones when they were in the hospital, or not being able to be with, I mean, like kids, not being able to be with their classmates and their friends. But, you know, the isolation is really, I think, what impacted people long term.
Yeah, I remember at the beginning of COVID, even just those first, I think that where we were living, it was like 2 weeks, you know, try not to leave your house and everyone stay home. And, you know, this is before we had our daughter. I can't even imagine if we would have had a toddler. And this time, and my heart goes out to those parents. Yes. Yes. But I started noticing myself and my behavior change drastically. And, you know, there are these set of rules. You have, you know, the media telling you one thing. You have your government, your local government telling you one thing. You have your family telling you one thing. and you don't know what to believe. Everyone has a different opinion on it. Everyone has a different professional opinion on it. And you're kind of stuck in this really, I think just in this like decision-making process that we just haven't had to face as a culture in a long time.
Yeah.
And you know, for me, like, it's like if you're trying to follow the rules and stay home and then you see someone else doing something, you get angry. And then vice versa. Like if you're out there in the world and people are yelling at you for not wearing a mask, you get angry. And no one knows what to believe or who to believe.
Right.
And it causes a lot of tension and anxiety. And, you know, there's family members who don't speak to each other still just because of the implications of what happened. And it's been obviously one of the greatest shifts of our culture, you know, and at least as long as I've been alive.
Yeah. I mean, if we think about the basis of trauma being something that disrupts your core of safety.
Yeah. Nothing's going to do it more than a global pandemic.
Right? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, you know, I agree that it was definitely like a global trauma that was felt.
Yeah, 100%. So how about people who tend to minimize their trauma or push it aside or, you know, power through? What type of advice would you have for someone who is doing that? And you know, how can they even be aware of it?
Right. You know, we really like to compare. You know, I think that that's something that we're always pushed to do. But the reality is that what we experience is very personal. And if we can help people let go of this idea that their trauma versus someone else's trauma is better or worse or bigger or smaller, that's really a great starting point to really just begin to almost own your own experience and validate the fact that this is something that happened to you and this is how you experienced it. And that in and of itself is very personal. So it doesn't matter if it was this or this. You know, maybe your cousin experienced this and you experienced this, you know, a car wreck versus being in a house fire, right? And somebody would always say, well, the house fire, obviously, right? Because it's a much bigger event. The reality of that is that no, whatever you experienced and how it disrupted your own sense of safety is where I always try to have people start.
Yeah.
And so when we try to power through that, that's so interesting because the irony of this is that when we have trauma, our brain's job is to keep us safe and alive, right? And it does that by trying to help us avoid that specific trauma ever again. Yeah. And this is really the dichotomy of trauma in therapy is it's like we're asking people to bring up the most terrible things that have happened in their life and their brain is like, we're doing what?
Right.
Like, no, we're not doing that. And they've spent their life avoiding, you know, people, places, things, also avoiding how they feel. We see this through like just the disconnection of self where we get very afraid of how trauma shows up in our bodies because it is terrifying, right? Like it feels very out of control. And so people do not like to bring it up. So avoidance of trauma and not wanting to just power through and push that aside or, you know, set it on a shelf or whatever is a really natural response.
Yeah. I'm also curious too, while you were talking, do you think that sometimes people just utilize boundaries in order to not deal with their trauma?
Oh, man.
Boundaries is something that sounds super healthy, right?
Right? Yes. Wow. So golly, that's a great question. Like I have never actually thought of that, but as you said that, I was like, oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if the brain is wanting to avoid like reprocessing these traumatic things,
right?
You know, or potentially like, you know, different relationships or people in life, instead of actually developing, you know, working through the feelings and getting the coping mechanisms down, I wonder if we as humans just maybe create those things, call them boundaries, and we just push it to the side or push it under the rug.
Yeah. No, I think that, you know, we can use anything to, in a healthy way or in an unhealthy way. Just because it has the label of a boundary doesn't necessarily mean that it's a healthy one. Boundaries, any boundary, no matter what it is really meant to protect your personal safety, but also protect your personal core values.
Yeah.
And so I think that would always be a question that I would ask is, if somebody is saying, oh no, like I have this boundary, but really it's just an avoidance, what personal value, it may be protecting your safety, but is it also protecting some type of personal value, or is it keeping you from a personal value that you need?
Oh, that's really good. That's great advice. So, I'm sure we could all probably come up with what our personal values are, but if there's someone who is like, yes, I want to start doing that, I want to take your advice, how does someone like identify what their personal values are? Like what type of self-reflective exercise could they potentially do?
There's actually a lot out there on this. And I would encourage somebody to just really sit down, and it sounds so simple, but think about the things that are important to you. Write them down. See if you can see like themes or categories or patterns in these things. I mean, mine almost always goes back to intentional time and connection with people. That's one of my, own personal largest core values. And when we begin to see the things that are important to us, that does help us to better define what our core value sets are. And then just making sure that once you go, oh, wow, okay, my connection with people and having, intentional time with them is important. Are there things in my life that are keeping me from that?
Yeah.
And if so, I have to look at that and go, oh, is that me? And if it's me, right, like, am I doing that?
Am I the problem?
Am I the problem, right? Then we have to look at creating a personal boundary for ourselves.
Yeah.
And if it's not me, and maybe it's something out here, then we have to look at that and say, okay, what do I need to shift to be able to function in this space and still keep this core value?
Yeah, that's great. So if someone is looking for a therapist to work with, and they're wanting to focus specifically on like processing trauma, working through it, no matter how big, no matter how small, what types of things should they look for when they're trying to find a therapist? We're kind of in the age of people using ChatGPT as a therapist,
right?
Doing things online, telehealth, going into clinics. There's so many options out there.
Yes, you're right. There are so many options. And, I have a really difficult time saying that any option is not good, right? Because I just think that for some people, just taking that first small step is the thing.
Yeah.
It is what helps them get started. And so whatever that is, whatever that first small step is important. And I would encourage them to just take that. But if you're looking in the world of therapy and you think, oh no, like I'm ready to jump in, I want to find a therapist that is going to help me actually process trauma. There are a couple of different modalities that I would say that help with the training of that. So, I mean, you want to look for somebody who's trained in EMDR, which is, eye movement sensory processing, right? So, ART, which is accelerated resolution therapy, maybe IFS or internal family systems, cognitive processing therapy, or trauma-informed CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy. So those are kind of the top 5 trainings that help therapists be able to help people process and heal from trauma.
Yeah, so that's a lot of different categories.
Yeah.
How does someone know what to go with? Or is it just kind of, you just have to start making phone calls? Do therapists ever do like a get to know me, or how does that work for someone who's just never done it before?
Yeah, lots of therapists do consultations.
Yeah.
And I think that that's always a really great place to start. But it's interesting because I don't know, how do you get to know if this is going to work for you in like 15 or 20 minutes?
Right.
That's really difficult. And I do hear this a lot from clients that the challenge and the frustration of the therapy process is in the finding of a therapist that they feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
But, I try to also think of this as like we do this with everything else where, I mean, we shop our doctors, right? We go to and we find different experiences that work for us. And the expectation that the first time you step into therapy with the first therapist that you meet, that it's going to be the one, I think is a really high bar to set. Yeah. So, just being open to the possibility that you may have to go a few different times to a few different therapists, and not being afraid to walk away. And I tell my clients this all the time. Listen, like, not all therapists are for all people, but there is a therapist out there for you. And if we meet and we begin working together and something isn't working for you, I'm never going to take that personally. I want you to find that relationship that creates the most amount of safety for you so that you can get the most amount of help. Yeah. And people don't, like, they're afraid to hurt. That I have found that they're like, oh, I don't want to hurt your feelings. Right. And I'm like, oh, like, it's so sweet of you, but like, really. But looking online, that's always where people start. Yeah. And, it is easy to just do a Google search for, trauma therapists. And then you're going to find a whole bunch that come up. And sometimes just going through and just doing what we would normally do, go from a visual standpoint first. Is this person going to work for you in the way that they appear online? Do a little bit of research behind the scenes. Yeah. And then from there, doing a couple consultations, seeing how you felt in just that first 15 or 20 minutes, asking the questions of, can you help me understand why, let's say, EMDR is why you think that works best. Maybe this is the type of trauma that I have. And I think that's really key too, is helping people understand that there are different types of trauma. And I think that helps them to own a little bit of their own trauma story when they're able to say, like, oh, I have complex trauma. I was exposed repetitively throughout childhood to unsafety at the hands of a caretaker or an adult, right? And because of that, I'm having a really hard time in this area of my life. Yeah. And knowing that that is the type of trauma that you have, asking a therapist, do you have experience with this? Yeah. Is really important.
Yeah. So I feel like it would take a lot of self-awareness, especially if you experienced trauma as a child, to even get to that point. Yeah. Where it's like, this is what happened to me. Right. Just because, kind of probably because of what you said earlier of the brain just wanting to shut it off. Yeah. Let's not go there.
Right. Well, and the interesting thing about a lot of complex trauma is that it's generational. Yeah. Right. So it's been normalized over so many different years. I mean, it happened to their mom or their dad. And so, I mean, there's a lot of people that grow up thinking this is just what happens. Yeah. And yet they're struggling in these various areas of their life, most of the time relationally. We see trauma show up always in relationships and our ability to connect with others. Yeah. And
whether that's like a parent-child relationship, spouse, friendship, coworkers.
100%.
It's that human interaction.
It is.
That kind of shows, hey, something might be off.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's really where, I see that, and you're right. And so then it's like, right, we're asking people to do the impossible. They're having a difficult time connecting with people. And then we're like, go to therapy, connect with a total stranger who you don't know. And then like share some of the most difficult things. So the process itself is hard. Yeah. And it takes a considerable amount. I mean, people who enter therapy are just like, I look at them, I'm like the courage. Yeah. Is always just something that's just very inspiring to me.
They've overcome so much just to get to that step, which often we minimize as, oh, this is the first step. It's like, no, they've taken so many steps to get here.
Yes. Yeah.
It's where healing begins,
That's right.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you this question because I'm so curious your take on this. And I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but I'm seeing this all over TikTok where people are using ChatGPT as a therapist. Right. What is your take on that?
I'm sure that there are definitely going to be some people that disagree with me on this. But if that's where you have to start there.
Amazing.
Right. I mean,
I love that.
So if that is the only place that you can feel safe and comfortable to begin, start there.
Kind of like journaling, but you get feedback.
Yep. Yes. I mean, some people's like sense of safety has been so disrupted that the thought of trying to connect with another human being with something that they're really having a hard time with, it's a no-go. They're not going to do it because they can't. And so for me, are there times that I'm like, I'll have a client that'll walk in and they're like, chat GPT. And I'm like, oh, I know, but I'm sure it's the same way that doctors feel about when we walk in and we're like, I Googled this.
WebMD said
right?
that.
Right. But it also gives them insight. Yeah. So even if it's AI, they're getting insight and they're getting some type of feedback about themselves that they can work with.
Mm-hmm. I love that. That's such a great answer. Although I did see, I think it was maybe last week, that one of the founders of OpenAI or ChatGPT, people were complaining that chat has become too, I think the word that they used was glossy or like nice, like just affirming everything, encouraging them. People were making TikToks about like, hey, ChatGPT, should I throw this car battery into the ocean? And Chat's like, yes, great idea. You're, this or that, finding like the most silver lining that it possibly could. So while it's not perfect, I've actually used ChatGPT to process like different conversations or things. And it's a great place to start. I agree with you on that. So I've seen another thing, of course, on TikTok where people will share an experience from their life and somewhere in the text, it's like, then I realized this wasn't normal. So what are some things that, might be showing up small or like in our day-to-day lives that might be signs of trauma that people might just be ignoring?
Yeah, great question. So, our bodies, I do believe that our bodies really do keep the score of things that happen. And because trauma is felt, that's obviously going to impact all of our systems, not just our brain, our immune system, our, everything. So things to look for, there's a lot of research now that tells us that unresolved and unprocessed trauma show up in disease states.
Yes.
And so I would say, like, if you have multiple disease states going on, chronic pain is a really big one, with no injury that precurses it, right? So chronic pain, chronic fatigue, carrying around unprocessed trauma is exhausting for the brain and body because we're in this like hypervigilant state that's always on alert. We're like always on guard, and that keeps every system on. And you are walking around with every single system on that you have, and there's no rest. And so chronic fatigue, I think, is a big one. Some autoimmune disorders, fibromyalgia. I'm not saying that everyone who has these has trauma, but there is a really high correlation to those. And then you look at those, and if you have some of those, and then you also have some of the things that are like high anxiety all the time, repetitive panic attacks. And, a lot of these are what we would say are like hyperarousal states, because when...
Like hypervigilance kind of.
Yeah. Hypervigilance is that like always on guard, something bad's going to happen. I'm looking out all the time. Yeah. The hyperarousal is your body's response to that. So it's that high anxiety, repetitive overthinking type of personality. I tell my clients all the time that trauma changes, like our limbic system, really, I like to think of like a volume control. Sometimes it needs to be turned up when we're in a certain area and like it perceives unsafety, right? So it's going to turn up a little bit. But then when it figures out that we're safe, it dials itself back down. But when we are carrying around trauma changes that volume control into like a light, so an on-off switch, and it keeps it on. It's stuck on all the time. And because of that, we're going to see anxiety, panic attacks, depression, high mood dysregulation, that person who just is like, I'm so great. And then all of a sudden, like 2 minutes later, they're, crying or they've spun out, right? And there's no regulation there. A really low tolerance to stress, and then the opposite of that, right? Like we actually see trauma response on the polar opposite end in super high performers. These people who are, always in control. They have remarkably high stress tolerances, right? Like you look at it and you're like, what? Like, how are you like functioning like that, right? And they're like, it's just what I do. But those can also be trauma responses.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think just looking at, how's my body responding? How am I feeling? And then knowing that just some of those pieces have a high correlation.
So if someone's listening and they identify with that, where they're like, yes, I am hypervigilant. I try to keep a positive attitude. I definitely experience anxiety from time to time. But whenever someone asks me like, oh, are you stressed? The answer I feel like for that type of person is often, no, I'm fine.
Right.
And they believe that.
Yes.
And I think we probably all have someone in mind if it's not ourselves.
Right. That's what I was going to say. I feel like you're describing me.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm describing me too.
Right.
So I think this is something that's really common. And for me, if you were to ask me that question, there's nothing that I could come up with to be like, oh, this is stressing me out, or this is making me feel anxious, or, this or that. And I feel like I'm someone who's pretty self-aware. I like to do the internal work. And I feel like there probably still is some unprocessed trauma somewhere in me, but how do I go digging for that? How do I identify it without just, on the other hand, like you don't want to get into rumination where you're always trying to think about all these bad things. Like what's the answer there?
Yeah. So I think this is going to probably be different depending on who you talk to.
Yeah.
My personal and also my clinical thoughts on this is that if it is not causing a problem in your daily life, I do not believe that we have to unearth all things. I don't believe that we have to go digging around looking for the things. Now if something's showing up and you're like, why all of a sudden am I like overthinking this, or why am I, whatever it is, then yeah, like let's see if there's some connections there. But I mean, every person walking around on the earth probably has at least a little bit of unprocessed trauma. But I think resilience also goes to, like, it plays a huge role in your ability to manage that. And there's a lot of research on resilience right now that's pretty interesting, because we don't really know why some people just have this like naturally high level of resilience and others have a really low level of resilience. There are some factors there, but we can look at somebody who you're like, all of these factors, you should not be able to deal with this. And they're dealing well.
Right.
So if you're dealing well and you're okay, and it's not showing up in a way that's disruptive or reducing your function, I would say that your resilience is kicking in. Your natural ability to tolerate and manage is working the way that it should. Yeah.
And kind of going back to what you said earlier, a great indicator of that is just if you feel like something if something is blocking you from aligning with your core values.
Yes.
Like if you're not doing well, like in your friend group, or if you keep running into the same problems with someone, or, these different scenarios, that's whenever you take a step back, look inward and figure out, okay, this is what's going on. Then ask yourself why.
Right.
And, I think it's probably a good idea to go to a professional to help you ask those questions because, the mind does some funny things, and depending on where you're at, who knows which direction it could take you, or if it takes you down a healthy path or maybe a not so healthy path where you just are blaming yourself for things that, that's obviously not the goal of this. So, that's really helpful.
Yeah. Good.
So I have another question.
Okay.
Whenever you were talking about trauma being stored in the body physically, and, it's affecting your nervous system, you see these people like body workers, or people like in this, maybe like the chiropractic space, where they are doing this energy work.
Right.
I'm so curious to hear your take on this, and like, how do we address that stored trauma in the body? Is it with our mind, like through therapy? Is it through body work? Is it through exercise? Some people say, oh, this hip stretch will make you start crying.
Right.
If you, and like it's trauma stored in your hip.
Right.
I'm curious to know your thoughts around that.
Yeah. So growing up in New Mexico, it's very holistic there. Yeah. It can be a little bit like, new agey. Yeah. And so, I grew up around a lot of that. And so I feel like that really kind of set a basis for me to be a little bit more open to some of these types of practices. But I really believe in the connection in mind body. And I do believe, it's, if we think of our bodies like a vehicle, right? Like, we're not going to take our car when it needs a new transmission to a place that only works on air conditionings,
Right. Of
right.
course.
And I think of it this way. I mean, the healing space is full of different types of healers. And for some people, body work, frequency work, that may not be their thing.
Yeah.
They may not have the ability to believe in that. And that's the number one thing that is the most healing for people, is their belief in whatever it is that they're committing to.
I totally agree
Right.
with you.
So, I mean, this is the same in therapy, is that they have to believe that on some level that therapy is going to work.
Yeah.
And it's their belief in the process. And so, it's hard to try to convince somebody to go, do a hip opening stretch, because it's going to release trauma out of, if they don't truly believe that.
Yeah. Their intention has to match the desired outcome.
100%.
Yeah.
But I also think that there's a lot to like psychoeducation. And so, in my practice, I tease my clients a lot, and they tell me that I'm kind of a nerd, because I kind of am, but I do a lot of, I feel like if you can help people understand things, they are then able to make a choice for themselves. And right. And so like, this is what this is why it works. And I always try to go back to the science behind what the connection of the mind body is. And then I just let them have the freedom to make the choice that they feel is best for them based upon like factual information.
Yeah.
So I love it. I actually have one of my cousins does body work, and I did an entire like tuning fork session with her. And for as open as I am to some of these things, I mean, there was truly a part of me that was like, oh, okay. But by the time that we were done, I felt amazing. Yeah. I was having some issues with my back, and within 24 hours, my back like aligned itself. I was literally sitting like in a chair, and all of a sudden it was like, and it did this thing, and I was like, oh my gosh. And it stayed. I mean, like I have had,
so cool.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that our bodies are really meant to heal themselves.
Yeah.
But we do so much stuff in our day-to-day lives that gets like in the way of that and kind of clogs up that ability. So if we can find somebody that will help us with that, I'm all for that.
Kind of sounds like no matter the modality, the mind-body connection takes precedence, because you have to believe in that outcome and that it's going to happen for you.
Right.
Just like, an NBA star wouldn't stand at the free throw line and visualize themselves not making it.
Right.
Like that, it's so important to have that mind-body connection. And, your story with your back reminds me a lot of Joe Dispenza. I don't know if you have seen his stuff. Big fan over here. And, he visualized his back healing, and it was, same thing. He was able to, or his body, through the mind-body connection, he healed himself. Yeah. And it's this phenomenal ability that we've seen proven in humankind time and time again. Right. And sometimes our thoughts get in the way of that. But yeah, that's so fascinating. And it's so interesting too, hearing it from like a mental health professional, that you've had a similar experience with that. Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I mean, especially in this part of the country, I think, there's still a lot of stigma and negative thought around some of those practices. And I get it. And so, I mean, it back to sort of aligning with core values. I mean, don't pick a practice or a technique or a person that maybe makes you feel unsafe or uncomfortable within like your own spiritual practice.
Right. Because then it's for sure not going to do you good.
Yeah, right. And so I just think that there's a lot of places, there's just, the space is so open, and there's a lot of opportunity and choice. And so like, keep pressing in, keep finding what works for you. And if you find something that doesn't work for you, don't be afraid to walk away from that and find something else.
All right, Jessica, where can everyone find you?
So I'm not really on social media very much. I know I keep getting pressure to change that. And maybe I will one of these days, but I practice at Soaak clinics. And then I also have a community mental health practice in different parts of rural Oklahoma.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So everyone go follow at Soaak Clinics, and you can see Jessica and some of her content featured on there. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. If you loved this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs it. You can find us on Instagram at Soaak Podcast for more inspiration and wellness insights. Thanks for being here. And until next time, keep tuning into what truly matters.